So our second speaker then is Grant Stentiford. I've had the privilege of knowing Grant for a few years. Grant is the Seafood Hazards Theme Lead and Head of the OIE Collaborating Centre for Emerging Aquatic Animal Diseases at Cefas. The OIE is the equivalent of the World Health Organization really for animals. It's the Office Internationale Epizootie. In addition to his role at Cefas, Grant is co-director of the Sustainable Aquaculture Future Centre at the University of Exeter. He was director of the European Union Reference Lab for Crustacean Diseases on behalf of DG Sanco of the European Commission between 2008 and 2018, and science lead for aquatic animal health at Cefas from 2016 to 2019. His work focuses on the identification and impact of aquatic animal diseases in farmed and wild environments. He's led the development of the One Health Aquaculture and All Hazards concepts within Cefas, building these into their home and overseas programme work. Over to you, Grant.
Thank you very much, Simon. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction, and also thank you to Tamsin for really setting this talk up very nicely. I don't think the National Fish Strategy really covered aquatics per se in this first round, but I'm here to, I guess, to raise a flag for all of the stuff that goes on underneath the water. 70% of the planet, as you probably know, is ocean, and even more of that, even more is underwater in some way in our land masses. And a lot of that space potentially able to be used for growing food, and has been done over many centuries via a fishery that occurs within freshwaters and marine systems. This is oysters here growing on some ropes, and it's sort of classic sort of farm, these small clusters of oysters which are ready to be picked up and eaten. So I'm going to come back to that kind of aquaculture in a second, because this shows a form of aquaculture that really doesn't require any feeding whatsoever. So just to start you off, blue food is the phrase that seems to be quite trendy at the moment in terms of what we might be by aquatic food or seafood. So this is all food including seaweeds and shrimp and lobsters and crabs and different types of mollusk and salmon and all the stuff that comes from the water. So everything you would classify as seafood in its broader sense from freshwaters and from the sea would be classified as blue food. And there's been some very, very nice work done recently in some sort of fairly high-ranking journals which is now starting to talk about blue food or seafood in the context of other food sectors. And I think anyone who's worked on aquaculture or fisheries over the years has realised that really the aquatic part of our food has been sort of ignored from the global debate around food security generally, and that's despite fisheries and aquaculture contributing 180 million metric tons of animals to that mass that Tamsin mentioned earlier on. So these are by no means small sectors, and a lot of people rely on these globally for their protein. These papers that are starting to come out now on aquatic foods, as we may expect, and as many of us have sort of known for a while, if you're growing animals in water where they suspend their bodies in that medium and they're cold-blooded compared to the animals on land, so their efficiencies of growing are generally better than many animals on land. If you look at that kind of those metrics against each other and against other systems, you find these standardized how much stress do they put on the environment in terms of greenhouse gases, nitrogen, phosphorus, freshwater uses, land use, and so on per ton of edible weight. They come out really quite well. This paper was in Nature recently, using chicken as a benchmark. Chicken is, I think, probably my colleagues could tell me more about terrestrial systems, but probably one of the most efficient of the terrestrial animal systems. So they used that as a benchmark here, and found that some animals and systems underwater really did perform very well, even against chicken. So at the sort of really sort of good end of the scale, you've got things like bivalves and seaweeds, which are extractive. They don't need to be fed at all. They extract nitrogen and phosphorus from the system, and also can enhance the biodiversity and sort of natural capital around them. Often those farms provide a net benefit to those locations. So this paper really started to look at that and to try to bring out some of those benefits of this, and also talk about some interventions to make those systems even more efficient. For instance, fed aquaculture, that means all the animals that are fed in those systems, like salmon, the emissions of those systems are mainly related to the feeds. So feeds that are often grown on land, or they're taken from a fishery and made into fish meal, etc. That's where most of the, if you like, the impact occurs within those sectors. And if you're talking about fisheries, most of the emissions and impact comes from the fuel used for fishing boats. So the paper's starting to now talk about how to improve upon those metrics to really drive us towards much more efficient food systems. But generally, aquatics they stack up very well in this respect. I was born in 1975, and my family, if they're eating fish at the time, which they were, would have got about 1 in 10 portions of fish from aquaculture. The rest came from capture fisheries. So all of us in this room up to this point have really relied on the capture fishery for our fish. We're now about at the stage where around about 50% of all blue food, seafood, comes from aquaculture. And by the time our kids get to our age in about 2050, then most of their seafood or blue food will come from aquaculture rather than fisheries, because the global fishery from freshwaters and marine systems is flat and maybe even slightly declining due to better management and understanding of the impact of overfishing. So the growth in demand that we know is occurring will come from aquaculture. And Cefas and the work that I do, I'm a pathologist working on animal diseases. We're really interested in that desire to expand aquaculture and potentially some of the barriers that are going to stop us getting to that growth in a sustainable manner. If you look at where aquaculture is done, the majority of aquaculture, this is a map, by the way, sorry, I should have mentioned, of nations which are eligible for ODA funding from the UK. Low and middle income countries is another phrase sometimes used. And the colours here show where those nations are. And I've just put on here the asterisks show the top 16 aquaculture producing nations in the world. And those 16 nations are all ODA eligible. And they produce about 95% of all the global aquaculture. The expansion in the future to 2050 is also going to majority occur within those nations. And again, some of the work that Cefas and DEFRA are interested in is, if that expansion is occurring, what are the kind of controls that will need to be in place in those nations to ensure that animal health and food safety and water quality is also written into the way that those nations may create that product into the future. So just give you some context of where aquaculture occurs in majority. China by far is the biggest producer. If you look a bit closer to home, we call these the ICES countries, which are these orange countries on the map here. They're listed down the middle of the globe, including the UK. We also see that the majority of those nations in the sort of northern hemisphere are net importers of seafood. So we've relied traditionally on capture fisheries. We haven't really developed aquaculture sectors to keep up with our demand. And there is prediction that by 2050, there'll be around about a 7 million metric ton deficit in the seafood that we want and that we produce. And there's a sort of debate around where that's going to come from as trade changes. At the moment, we rely on imports in the UK from nations in the global south. We like warm water prawns is a good example. That's tropical production mainly. But whether that will become available to us in 2050 as the global trade in seafood changes is for debate. So there's a perception that how are we going to get that seafood into the future as we want it. So even closer to home, there's a story around aquaculture and our future seafood supply. So at Cefas, what we've been doing is looking at that gap, both in Europe and the ICES countries, but also overseas, and trying to live, I guess, by our values of saying, well, DEFRA have a the strapline of the environment bill is to leave the environment in the best place and we found it, and that's a very good aspiration. Food systems, as Tamsin mentioned, really have to fit into that. If you want to solve climate issues, if you want to solve biodiversity problems, the food system is absolutely integral to doing that. And aquaculture, as it grows in importance, is going to become really important for that too. So we've done this sort of analysis, we call it One Health Aquaculture, where we've looked to understand whether we can apply One Health principles. That's principles which look at environmental, organism, and human health in the round, and see whether those One Health principles can be applied to an aim, in this case, to create a sustainable aquaculture sector. So that's a blue ring around the outside. And if you look at this sort of kind of like, schematic, and you go from the middle outwards, you can then say, if you go outside of immediate people working in aquaculture like myself, and you talk about people who understand gender equality or income generation or footprints or biodiversity or whatever it may be around this wheel, there is a lot more expertise that's going to be required to, if you like, solve the problem of creating a sustainable food industry, in this case aquaculture, than currently are working on it. Food being the sort of thing that links it all together rather than the specialism of aquaculture. And I think that's where a One Health approach is going to be needed increasingly. I think Tamsin probably touched upon that in her talk as well, that we need this much more sort of holistic approach to how we design food systems. What research and evidence and policy and legislation do we need to build into that to create these success metrics that are around the outside of this circle? So that's a One Health aquaculture approach, and we're sort of looking to sort of test that, I guess, in different places now at home and abroad. Final slide. If you then look at the blue food, I guess, revolution that's occurring, there is definitely needs to be increasing recognition of the key role of blue foods as part of the food system. So the interaction between land-based and water-based food will become much more important. A lot of our work in seafood within Cefas revolves around hazards, so chemicals and pathogens which in some way stop us in our tracks of making seafood. And I would say that, it's only seafood if you can eat it, and that might make, it might be very obvious, but there's no point in attempting to grow large amounts of seafood in your national waters if you haven't controlled the environmental hazards which are potentially going to accumulate within those seafoods. So it's really important to start linking environmental policy with food policy. Managing the hazards are critical. For us, it's water quality and ecosystem protection. How do we protect natural capital around these seaweed farms here in Tanzania? Bringing food policy and environment closer together is really important. DEFRA are a department that have Department for Environment and Food under the same sort of policy umbrella, arguably. Other nations often have a Department for Agriculture, a Department for Environment, and sometimes their objectives are very, very different. One's there to protect the environment, one's there to make more food. How do we bring those two things closer together? For the UK, we're going to need to look at where our food comes from, offshoring of the impact. That means it's produced somewhere else, they can worry about the impact. I think is going to become less acceptable as we go on. And also to do that, then we're going to need to understand the societal and consumer behaviours which must be written into this new approach that we are proposing to take. If you want to find out more, you can get in touch. I'm very happy to talk about this with anybody who might want to talk about it. There's some contact details there. At Cefas, this is wrapped up into one of our blocks of, if you like, specialisms around 2 centres of excellence and some designations, as Simon mentioned, to the OIE and the FAO. And I should give a shout out also to our link to the University of Exeter, where we've got a Sustainable Aquaculture Future Centre, and that reaches in really from a government sort of agency like ourselves and link quite close to policy into that really good offering of UK academia that can offer some sort of more of a holistic approach to some of the solutions that will be required in this area. Thanks very much.
That's fantastic, Grant. Thank you so much for that. A couple of quick questions, which I'll maybe just grab just now. Joe has asked, is the chicken benchmark based on intensive or cage systems or extensive or free range systems?
I believe it's that question. It's about the intensive systems, I think. Yeah, I'll check, but I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I think I've read that paper as well, and that would be my understanding. And Andrew asks, should aquaculture be based on native species because introduced organisms that grow successfully in a given environment are bound to escape and compete with local wildlife? It would make locally sourced food more valuable globally.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, a lot of the global system is not based upon local production. Penaeus vanami, the shrimp, is grown all over Asia, and it's a Pacific species. So that's a good example of where you've got a non-native organism. Arguably, yes, that would be the case. The only sort of thing against that is that you then potentially got sort of introgression genetically of escapees that could get into that system, and there's an argument the other way. So whatever we talk about non-natives within the One Health paper is one of the metrics that we need to be really careful of. So yeah, it's just having a look at some of the pros and cons there in that paper will be useful.
Fantastic. Thanks, Grant.